In the Grand Federal Courthouse of Washington, D.C., the sound of the gavel echoed through the room, sealing Emily Jameson's fate. She sat at the defendant's table, her back straight, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the worn leather journal before her. At 34, she had always prided herself on her quiet strength, but today, in the face of false accusations, it felt as though the very walls of the courtroom were closing in on her. The marble columns and dark mahogany panels loomed over her like giants, intimidating and cold, designed for one purpose: to crush anyone who didn't belong. Judge William Crawford sat high above her on the bench, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. Known for his ruthless decisions and political ties, his reputation preceded him. To most, he was a symbol of justice, but to Emily he represented something much darker, a tool of corruption. His disdain for her was palpable as he leaned forward, his voice icy and detached. "Miss Jameson, how do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Emily replied, her voice steady but quiet. The room felt heavy, and she could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom bearing down on her. Her lawyer, Mark Simmons, stood beside her, his nervous energy betraying his inexperience. She could see the skepticism in the eyes of the jury, their expressions a mix of suspicion and indifference. The prosecutor, Richard Vaughn, rose to his feet with practiced ease. His tailored suit and confident demeanor exuded power, but Emily knew better. His polished exterior was a mask for his political ambitions. "Your Honor, the state requests that bail be denied. Miss Jameson poses a flight risk," Vaughn announced, his voice smooth, like a snake ready to strike. Emily's stomach tightened at Vaughn's words, but she didn't flinch. She had worked tirelessly for years to build a community center that had become a safe haven for hundreds of children, and now to be accused of obstructing justice and tampering with government documents, it was a nightmare. Her center wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of hope for families who had nowhere else to turn. And now those same families were being used as pawns in a game of corporate greed and political maneuvering. Mark Simmons, her court-appointed attorney, looked like a deer caught in headlights as he fumbled through his papers. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaky, "my client has deep roots in this community. She runs a children's center that serves over 200 families. She's not going anywhere." Judge Crawford's lips twisted into something resembling a smile, but it was cold and predatory. "Mr. Simmons," he drawled, "your client is accused of falsifying documents to prevent the lawful development of a property worth millions. These are serious charges." Emily's mind raced as she heard the words, but she forced herself to stay composed. She knew the truth. The development was just a corporate land grab that threatened to tear apart her community. But she couldn't say it here, not now. The prosecutor continued to parade witness after witness, each one painting a picture of Emily as a troublemaker willing to break the law for her personal agenda. She could feel the walls closing in, but then, as if on cue, the courtroom doors creaked open and all attention shifted to the back of the room. Time seemed to stop as a commanding figure entered the courtroom. James Martinez, her husband, walked in, not just as a husband, but as a Supreme Court justice. His presence was overwhelming, and his gaze, laden with authority, promised that the true battle for justice had only just begun. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as James Martinez approached the front. Emily could feel the air shift, tension thickening with every step he took. James had always been a calm presence in her life, a grounding force in the chaos, but today his arrival was nothing short of a game-changer. Dressed in his tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair streaked with wisdom, he didn't look like the man she'd fallen in love with so many years ago. He looked every bit the Supreme Court justice he was, a figure of authority and strength. The murmur of the spectators grew louder as they recognized him, but it was the look on Judge Crawford's face that caught Emily's attention. The color drained from his features as he stared at James, his confident posture faltering for the first time that day. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Emily could sense the shift in power. This was no longer just about her case. It was about something much bigger. "Proceedings will continue," Judge Crawford said, his voice tinged with uncertainty as his gavel slammed down with a force that echoed in the quiet room. But even as he tried to regain control, his hands shook slightly. James's presence had rattled him. "Your Honor?" James's voice rang out, deep and commanding. "I request permission to approach." Judge Crawford hesitated, his eyes narrowing with a mix of irritation and unease. "Justice Martinez," he acknowledged stiffly, but the familiarity in his voice couldn't mask the surprise. He had not expected this. Emily's heart raced as James made his way to the center aisle. She had known he was capable, but seeing him stand there, so calm, so sure of himself, gave her hope in a way she hadn't felt since the trial began. James's steps were deliberate as he crossed the courtroom floor, every eye now fixed on him. He stopped just before the barrier that separated the spectators from the court proper, his gaze never leaving Judge Crawford. There was a quiet intensity in the way he held himself, a kind of authority that had the power to shift the atmosphere in an instant. Emily could feel her pulse quicken as he addressed the judge directly, his voice smooth but commanding. "Your Honor, I request permission to approach," James said again, his tone unyielding. The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Crawford's eyes flickered momentarily to the gallery, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His earlier confidence was slipping, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible unease. He didn't want to grant this request, but he knew that denying it could make him appear even weaker in front of the courtroom. "Proceed, Justice Martinez," Crawford finally muttered, his voice tight. With a slight nod, James stepped forward, crossing the line that divided him from the rest of the courtroom. The movement felt like a declaration, as if he were stepping into a battleground and taking control. Emily watched in awe as he approached the bench with all the calm of a man who had faced down the most difficult cases in the nation's highest courts. "I'm here to represent not only my wife, but also the principles of justice that should guide every decision in this room," James began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the courtroom. "And I believe it is time we address the truth about the proceedings in this case." Judge Crawford stiffened at the words, but before he could respond, James placed a thick leather portfolio on the desk in front of him with a deliberate motion. The sound of it hitting the wood seemed to echo throughout the room. Emily felt a surge of hope as she watched Crawford's face grow even paler. James wasn't just here to defend her. He was here to expose the corruption that had been festering in this courtroom all along. The weight of what was happening sank in. This wasn't just a battle for Emily's innocence anymore. This was about exposing a system that had been rigged from the very beginning. The courtroom was still as a tomb when James Martinez, his expression unwavering, turned his full attention to Judge Crawford. The tension in the air was so thick, Emily could almost taste it. She had always known James to be calm under pressure, but today, with the weight of everything on his shoulders, he was something else entirely, an embodiment of authority that even Crawford couldn't ignore. The spectators, who had been murmuring moments before, now watched in stunned silence, sensing that a shift in the tide was coming. James's voice broke through the silence, calm yet commanding. "Your Honor, I am here to ensure that my wife receives the fair trial she is entitled to, something that is in question today, given the circumstances surrounding this case." He placed his hands on the desk in front of Crawford, his fingers curled slightly, just enough to show the weight of his words. "I request that we address the ethical concerns surrounding your involvement in this matter." Judge Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usual arrogance, the kind that had carried him through countless high-profile cases, was now faltering under James's gaze. He straightened, but his voice lacked the firmness it once had. "This is highly irregular," Crawford muttered, trying to maintain some semblance of control. James didn't flinch. "It's only irregular because you've spent years manipulating the system to suit your needs." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Crawford's response. "You have compromised this trial for personal gain, and it ends now." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She had always admired James's sharp mind, but seeing him in action, dismantling the very system that had sought to ruin her, made her realize just how much power he truly wielded. For the first time since this trial began, she felt a flicker of hope. This was far from over. Judge Crawford's face drained of color as James continued, his words cutting through the courtroom like a blade. The entire room could feel the shift, What had started as a routine trial was now an open confrontation between two powerful forces. James leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving Crawford's, and placed the leather portfolio in front of the judge with deliberate precision. "This contains everything you need to know," James said softly, his voice steady. "First, authenticated documents proving that the community center is a historical landmark. Second, affidavits from 7 residents who confirm that the signatures Emily collected were done ethically and with their full consent. And third, financial records linking you to Meridian Development through your brother-in-law's holding company. Enough evidence to show that you've been playing both sides of this case for your own benefit." The words hit like a thunderclap. Crawford's hands twitched, betraying his growing panic as his eyes flickered to the portfolio. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The very documents James had placed on the desk threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. His carefully constructed empire of influence in the legal world now hanging by a thread. Across the room, Emily watched the scene unfold with bated breath. She had never felt such a weight of validation and terror at the same time. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Proof that Crawford was no longer untouchable. But it wasn't over yet. There was more to be done. The courtroom fell into a deep silence, the only sound being the faint rustling of papers as James's accusation settled over them all. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the courtroom swung open, and Richard Vaughn, the ambitious prosecutor, stepped into the room. His confident smile faltered when he saw the unfolding confrontation. "Am I interrupting something?" Vaughn's voice was falsely cheerful, but it was clear he wasn't prepared for the storm that had just entered the room. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically, and the air felt charged with tension. James Martinez stood unwavering before Judge Crawford, his stance unyielding. The once proud and untouchable figure of Crawford was now visibly rattled, the facade of confidence cracking beneath the weight of the evidence James had just revealed. Emily watched closely, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this moment would come. She had fought for it. But seeing it unfold so swiftly, with James leading the charge, left her with a sense of awe she couldn't quite explain. Judge Crawford hesitated, the silence in the room stretching longer than anyone anticipated. For a brief moment, the judge appeared to consider his next move, but then he glanced down at the documents James had placed before him. His fingers twitched as though he wanted to reach for them, but was afraid of what they might expose. Finally, with an audible exhale, he spoke, his voice far less assured than before. "This is highly irregular, Justice Martinez," Crawford muttered, but his words were hollow, barely masking the fear building inside him. James didn't flinch. He had anticipated Crawford's pushback. "The only thing irregular here is the fact that this case was ever allowed to proceed with such blatant conflicts of interest." He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air before continuing. "I suggest we end this charade before it becomes even more damaging. You can step down now, or I can take this further. Your choice." The gallery seemed to lean forward, every spectator holding their breath, waiting for Crawford to react. Emily felt her palms sweat. This was the breaking point. The man who had sentenced countless individuals, who had built his career on political alliances and ruthless decisions, was now at the mercy of the very system he had corrupted. Would he fight back, or would he fold? For a moment it seemed as though Crawford might remain defiant, but then something changed. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he reached for the documents, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. "You leave me no choice," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the court to hear. "I will recuse myself from this case." The courtroom buzzed with a mix of disbelief and relief as Judge Crawford's words hung in the air. Emily felt a rush of emotions flood over her, relief that Crawford's reign of manipulation was crumbling, but also a deep sadness for the justice system that had allowed him to thrive for so long. The weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. She had always known the fight for truth was never going to be easy, but now, with Crawford backing down, it felt like a turning point, a hard-earned victory. James, however, remained calm, his face set in a determined expression. He had expected this outcome, but he wasn't celebrating just yet. "I trust you'll make this official, Judge," he said, his voice firm and cold. "And I'll be forwarding these documents to the appropriate authorities. You'll be hearing from the Ethics Committee." Crawford didn't respond. He simply nodded, his pride clearly shattered. He reached for the papers in front of him, his hands now steady as he wrote something on them. Emily noticed how every movement seemed slower, more deliberate, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear of what the future held for him. In either case, he was no longer the man who had been pulling the strings from his position of power. The court had finally seen through the facade, and it had cost him everything. The prosecution team, led by Richard Vaughn, stood frozen at their table, their faces draining of color as the full scope of James's influence became clear. They knew their position was weakening fast. Vaughn, ever the opportunist, stepped forward, his smile faltering but still trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Justice Martinez," he began, his voice strained. "We can—" James interrupted him with a sharp look. "There will be no deals here, Mr. Vaughn. Not now, not ever." His words were final, and the room seemed to settle into a stunned silence once again. As James turned to Emily, their eyes met for the briefest of moments. It was as if everything they had been through, all the sleepless nights, the fears, and the uncertainty, had culminated in this moment. Finally, the truth was being heard, but there was still work to be done. Crawford's recusal was only the beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, Emily felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, justice was within reach. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Crawford's recusal was announced. It was a small victory, but Emily knew it was only the beginning. The relief that washed over her was quickly replaced by a sense of urgency. This battle was far from over, and there was still much to do. James, standing tall beside her, had shattered the illusion of Crawford's untouchability, but they needed to press forward. The documents James had presented had not only exposed the corruption of the judge, but also hinted at a much deeper web of deceit that could unravel the entire case. As the room began to stir with whispers, Emily caught a glimpse of Vaughn's face. His confident demeanor had crumbled, and now he appeared visibly rattled. He had lost his footing, but that didn't mean he was out of the game. Emily knew that he would regroup, that he would fight back with every tactic at his disposal. And the prosecution's case, built on falsified evidence and lies, would not disappear just because Crawford stepped aside. They were still in the thick of it. James turned to her, his gaze softening for just a moment before hardening with determination. "This isn't over, Em," he said quietly, using the nickname that only he ever called her. "We've taken one step, but we have a long road ahead." His words grounded her, reminding her of the fight she had already won, but also of the fight still to come. The courtroom was cleared for a brief recess, but Emily didn't move. She needed a moment to gather herself, to process everything that had happened. And most of all, she needed to steel herself for what was next. What James had started was just the beginning of a larger battle, one that would expose the entire network of corruption surrounding her case. As the recess stretched on, Emily remained seated at the defendant's table, her thoughts racing. The rush of emotions from the moment James had entered the courtroom, turning the tide of her trial, was beginning to settle into a quiet resolve. Yet the weight of what lay ahead still lingered heavily on her shoulders. This case wasn't just about her. It was about exposing the systemic corruption that had allowed men like Crawford and Vaughn to operate with impunity. She had to keep going, no matter how personal the cost. James stepped over to her, his presence a steadying force in the whirlwind of thoughts that had been spinning in her mind. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and gentle, though she could see the determination in his eyes. He was always there, always so focused on the next step. He was her anchor, the one person who had never wavered in his support for her cause. "I'm fine," Emily replied, but the words felt hollow. She was fine in the sense that she was still standing, still fighting, but the battle was far from won. "It's just, I don't know what's going to happen next. We've only exposed a small part of the corruption. They won't let it end here." James's face darkened at her words, but he reached across the table, his hand enveloping hers. "You're right. But we've gained momentum, Em. And now we play this smart. We take everything we've uncovered and we push it out into the light. No more hiding behind closed doors. No more deals in the shadows. His words were a promise, and for the first time since this whole nightmare had started, Emily allowed herself to believe that they could win. They had the truth, and James was right. The light of day was the best weapon they had. The rest of the prosecution team would likely try to cover their tracks, but now with the public and the media on their side, they had a fighting chance. As the recess ended and the courtroom began to fill again, Emily felt a shift in the air. The momentum had swung in their favor, and she could feel the weight of it. The next phase of this battle was crucial. She wasn't just defending her innocence anymore. She was fighting to dismantle the very system that had tried to destroy her. And with James at her side, she knew she had the strength to see it through. The courtroom buzzed with a sense of unease as the recess came to an end. Emily could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the impending confrontation with the prosecution. Judge Crawford's recusal had been a victory, but it was just the beginning. James's presence had shaken the foundation of the case, but the real work was still ahead. As they returned to their seats, Emily's stomach churned with anxiety. She had been falsely accused, but the trial was far from over. Now they had to confront the lies head-on. Richard Vaughn, the prosecutor, was already seated, his expression colder than ever. He had been caught off guard by James's intervention, but he wasn't about to back down. Emily knew the game was far from won. Vaughn had a reputation for using every dirty trick in the book, and she was certain he would use all his power to manipulate the jury and turn the tide back in his favor. His political ambitions were no secret, and this case had become a battleground for his own career. As the judge returned to his seat and the courtroom settled, Vaughn stood, his voice smooth as ever. "Your Honor, we request that the defense be held to the highest standard of accountability. It's clear that the defendant has attempted to disrupt the judicial process with these baseless claims of corruption. We ask that you proceed swiftly with the trial to ensure that justice is done." His words dripped with false sincerity, and Emily could feel the heat rising in her chest. She had seen this tactic before, use the appearance of righteousness to push forward an unjust agenda. James, however, didn't flinch. His calm demeanor only amplified the power of his next words. "Your Honor," he said, standing to address the court, "the only disruption here has been the manipulation of evidence and the abuse of power by those who have tried to use this court as a political pawn. It is time for the truth to come to light." James's words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a brief moment, the entire courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The prosecution, the jury, even the bailiffs seemed to pause, as if weighing the weight of his statement. Emily could feel her heart racing as she watched Vaughn's expression darken. He had built his entire case on lies, on fabrications that James had now publicly dissected. But Vaughn wasn't the type to back down. Emily knew the battle wasn't over. In fact, it felt as though it was just beginning. Vaughn's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he stood, his smooth, practiced facade cracking slightly under the pressure. "Your Honor," he said, his voice colder now, "these accusations are baseless. They have no place in this courtroom. If Justice Martinez is so intent on playing the role of investigator, I suggest he save it for another venue." But James wasn't deterred. He stepped forward, his commanding presence filling the room, and addressed the judge with an air of finality. "I'm not playing any role here, Mr. Vaughn. I'm ensuring that my wife's innocence is protected and the truth is brought to light. If you had any shred of decency, you'd stop hiding behind falsehoods and allow this case to proceed fairly." Judge Crawford's replacement, a neutral judge who had been assigned temporarily after Crawford's recusal, leaned forward, clearly uncomfortable with the tension escalating. "This is a court of law," he interjected, "and I expect decorum. Let's focus on the evidence, not personal attacks." Vaughn shot the judge a tight-lipped smile, though it did nothing to mask the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, clearly trying to regain some semblance of control. "We're simply trying to ensure the integrity of these proceedings." Emily could see the pieces falling into place. James's bold move had forced Vaughn and the prosecution team into a defensive posture. They were scrambling now, and that was the opening they needed. The evidence was there, undeniable and damning. They only had to push a little further to reveal the full extent of the corruption that had been festering behind the scenes. But Emily knew this wasn't going to be easy. Vaughn would throw everything he had at them. With a deep breath, she braced herself for what came next. The truth was their weapon, but it was also the hardest thing to expose in a system so entrenched in its own lies. And now they had no choice but to see it through to the end. The courtroom had grown quiet once again, but the tension was far from gone. Emily's mind raced as she took in the events unfolding around her. James had made his move, and now the entire courtroom seemed to be on edge, each person waiting for the next shift. Judge Crawford had recused himself, but the corruption wasn't gone. The prosecution was still in full force, and Vaughn, though momentarily rattled, was already preparing his next strike. Emily could feel it. The fight was intensifying, but this time, the stakes were higher. James stood by her side, unwavering, his gaze sharp as ever. Emily couldn't help but admire his quiet strength. He had always been the calm in the storm, but now, with everything on the line, his presence was a shield she could rely on. "We need to stay focused," James whispered to her, his voice low but filled with determination. "We've exposed Crawford, but Vaughn is not going to make this easy." "I know," Emily replied, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the pressure mounting. They had won the battle to remove Crawford, but now they had to confront the prosecution head-on. And Vaughn, with his polished suit and ambitious demeanor, wasn't going to let this case slip away so easily. The words he had spoken just moments earlier echoed in her mind. He would stop at nothing to secure a win, even if it meant using every dirty trick in the book. The jury, who had been quiet throughout most of the proceedings, seemed to be shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Emily could see the weariness in their eyes, the uncertainty about who to believe. The lies had been so intricately woven together, and now it was up to them to untangle the truth. Emily had no illusions. She knew how hard it was to fight a system that had long been rigged. But this was her moment, and she wasn't going to back down. As the trial continued, the tension in the room seemed to swell with each passing minute. Emily sat on edge, her mind spinning with the weight of everything at stake. James, ever the calm and focused strategist, was keeping his eye on the bigger picture. He had always believed in justice, but now, with so much on the line, it was clear that this wasn't just a fight for her innocence. It was a fight for the very integrity of the system. The next witness called to the stand was someone Emily had dreaded seeing, Regina Parker. The city planning commissioner had been one of the key figures in the false evidence that had been presented against her. Emily had known this moment would come. The prosecution would call upon her to support their fabricated story, to paint her as a criminal intent on sabotaging a development project that would bring wealth to the area. Regina's poised and polished exterior made her a formidable opponent, but Emily wasn't about to let her take the stand without a fight. James's eyes flicked to Emily, silently reassuring her that they had already laid the groundwork to discredit Regina's testimony. Emily had hoped that this part of the trial would be over quickly, but she knew it was going to be another long and painful battle. As Regina took her seat at the witness stand, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. Vaughn stood, his smug demeanor returning as he prepared to call the shots. "Ms. Parker," Vaughn began, his voice smooth, "could you please explain to the court the nature of your interactions with the defendant, Ms. Jameson?" He smiled as he directed the question toward Regina, setting the stage for her to recount the story that the prosecution had carefully constructed. Regina took a moment, straightening her blouse, and then began. "Ms. Jameson has a history of obstructing city planning efforts," she began, her tone cool and rehearsed. "When she was informed that the development project had been approved, she submitted documents claiming that her community center was a historical landmark. We later discovered that the signatures she presented were falsified and the claims were entirely fabricated." Her eyes flicked over to Emily, betraying a hint of satisfaction. This was it. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. But Emily wasn't going to let Regina get away with it. The courtroom was electric with tension as Regina Parker finished her testimony. Emily could feel the weight of every word, each one designed to tighten the noose around her neck. But she didn't flinch. She had been through worse. She had seen the lies spun against her, and she knew how to face them. It wasn't about her now. It was about revealing the truth, no matter what it took. James stood with her, his posture firm and confident as he prepared to cross-examine Regina. He had a strategy in mind, one that would break down the lies piece by piece. As the courtroom waited in silence, James's voice cut through the stillness, calm and measured. "Ms. Parker," he began, "you've stated that the signatures collected by my client were falsified. Can you tell us who exactly verified the authenticity of those signatures?" Regina's eyes flickered, but her face remained composed. "We had experts analyze the signatures," she replied, her tone flat and rehearsed. "And these experts," James pressed, "did they personally speak to any of the individuals who signed those documents? Did they verify their consent?" Regina hesitated for a brief moment, the uncertainty flashing in her eyes before she masked it with an air of confidence. "No, they didn't," she admitted reluctantly. "But the signatures were inconsistent, which raised doubts." James nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "So, these experts you rely on have never spoken to the people who signed the documents. They made their conclusions based solely on their own analysis, without ever verifying the claims directly from the source?" The silence in the room deepened. The jury's eyes were now fixed on Regina, and Emily could feel the tide turning. Regina had relied on fabricated evidence, and James was exposing every hole in her story. But it wasn't enough yet. The full truth needed to come out. Every inch of corruption, every lie needed to be exposed for what it was. This wasn't just about winning the case. This was about making sure that justice wasn't buried beneath layers of deceit. Regina's composure was slipping now, her confident facade cracking under the pressure of James's precise questioning. She shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "The signatures were inconsistent," she repeated, though her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "That's all that matters. The evidence shows, but no one actually bothered to ask the people who signed whether they did so voluntarily, did they?" James interrupted, his voice growing firmer. "No one ever asked them if they knew what they were signing or if they were misled about the importance of the documents. Is that correct?" Regina's face flushed slightly, her mouth tightening. She opened her mouth to respond, but was cut off by James once again. "Let's be clear here, Ms. Parker," James continued, his voice unwavering. "You and the city planning department made an assumption based on these supposed inconsistencies. You didn't take the time to check with the community, to ask the residents themselves. Instead, you chose to move forward with your plans, ignoring the fact that people were actively trying to protect their homes, their community, from being erased. You saw the signatures as a threat to the project, and so you decided to label them as false." The courtroom was silent now, the tension thick as everyone waited for Regina's response, but she didn't have one. The cracks in her story were becoming impossible to ignore. James had cornered her, without raising his voice, without resorting to theatrics, simply by following the truth, piece by piece. Emily felt a surge of hope, but she knew better than to get ahead of herself. This was just one part of the puzzle. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the trial began, she felt as though the tide was truly turning in their favor. James had done more than challenge the prosecution's case. He had forced them into a corner, where the lies could no longer stand. And Emily knew that the truth would win. It always did. The tension in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch. James had skillfully dismantled the prosecution's key witness, and now the jury was left to grapple with the mounting evidence of corruption and deceit. But there was still one crucial piece left: the final witness, who would either confirm the cracks in the prosecution's case or attempt to patch them over with more lies. As the door at the back of the courtroom swung open, all eyes turned to the figure who stepped in. It was a face that Emily had hoped never to see again: Richard Vaughn. But today, he wasn't the confident prosecutor ready to make his case. His expression was tight, eyes darting nervously across the room, as if the weight of the moment was finally starting to sink in. James stood tall beside Emily, unwavering. He had already won the first part of the battle. The judge had been forced to address the systemic issues in the case, and the cracks in the prosecution's arguments were becoming impossible to ignore. Vaughn, however, wasn't ready to concede just yet. As he walked up to the stand, Emily could almost feel the shift in his energy. He was on the defensive now, no longer the one pulling the strings. "Mr. Vaughn," the judge said, his voice cold, "please proceed with your final witness." Vaughn glanced at the witness list and gave a brief nod. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the prosecutor signaled to the back of the courtroom. "The defense has had their turn," he said, his voice low but full of frustration. "But it's time we put an end to this charade. The truth will come out today." And with that, the witness entered, a new player in the game. The next chapter of the trial had begun, and Emily could feel the pressure building once again. This was it, the moment that would define everything. The witness took the stand, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was someone she never expected to see in a courtroom, a former city official who had worked closely with both Crawford and Vaughn. His name was Alan Richards, and he had once been a powerful player in the city's planning department. But he wasn't just any witness. Emily knew him well enough to understand that he was being called in to protect Vaughn's narrative, to provide the final, damning piece of the prosecution's case. She had seen the way he had turned his back on his former colleagues when the stakes got too high, always looking for the next opportunity to climb the ladder. Richards adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, looking at the jury with the kind of practiced sincerity that came from years of working behind the scenes. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and controlled. "I'm here today to shed light on the events that led to the approval of the development project that Ms. Jameson has been so adamantly opposing." James's posture didn't change, but Emily could feel the pressure building. The witness was about to deliver the final blow, or so it seemed. "Ms. Jameson," Richards continued, his gaze turning to Emily with feigned sympathy, "misled the community and attempted to obstruct the lawful development of this project by submitting falsified documents. Documents that were never meant to be part of the process." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "These actions were not only illegal, but were done in a deliberate attempt to derail the economic growth of the city." Emily's fingers clenched into fists at her side, but she didn't show it. She knew the truth, and so did James. But the moment Richards opened his mouth, Emily realized that the final twist in this trial was just beginning. The pieces were all in place, but now they would have to fight harder than ever to expose the lies Richards was about to weave. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Alan Richards finished his testimony. His words, meant to be the prosecution's final weapon, hung in the air like a storm cloud. Emily could feel the eyes of the jury on her, weighing her every reaction. Richards had painted her as the villain in this entire saga, a person willing to destroy everything for the sake of a community center. But Emily knew this wasn't the truth. It was a narrative woven from lies, and the truth would come out, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. James stood beside her, his calm demeanor unshaken by the accusation. But Emily could see the gears turning in his mind. He had prepared for this moment. He knew that Richards was just another piece in the puzzle of corruption they had been trying to expose. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to turn everything around, to strip the prosecution's lies bare. "Ms. Jameson," the judge called, his voice cutting through the tension, "you may proceed with your cross-examination." James didn't hesitate. He rose to his feet, his movements measured and confident. He was a master at this, calm, precise, and relentless when it came to exposing the truth. Emily felt a surge of hope. She had seen how hard James fought for justice, and now it was his turn to dismantle Richards' testimony piece by piece. "Mr. Richards," James began, his voice smooth and authoritative, "you've stated that Ms. Jameson submitted falsified documents. I'd like to ask you, how did you verify the authenticity of these documents before making such a statement?" Richard stiffened slightly, but he quickly recovered. "The documents were flagged by our team as irregular," he replied, his tone defensive. "We conducted an investigation and found inconsistencies." James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "And who conducted this investigation, Mr. Richards? Was it an independent, third-party expert, or was it your team, which is directly connected to the development project?" The room fell silent. Richards' eyes flickered, betraying a hint of uncertainty. Richard's confidence faltered as James pressed on. The room, once thick with the weight of accusations, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers twitching slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Our team conducted the analysis," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier conviction. "We're the ones who flagged the documents as problematic. Our process is thorough." James didn't miss a beat. "So, to be clear, your team, which is tied to the city's development project, flagged these documents without an independent review? No external oversight was involved. Richards hesitated, a moment of indecision passing over his face. The analysis was done in-house, he repeated, his voice now defensive, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. And isn't it true that your team had a vested interest in the outcome of this project? James continued, his eyes locked on Richards's. Isn't it true that your department stands to benefit financially from the success of this development? Richards shifted again, his discomfort now visible. He avoided eye contact with James and looked briefly at the jury, as if hoping they wouldn't notice his unease. We all want what's best for the city, he muttered. But the answer felt hollow. The entire room could sense it. James's voice grew more insistent, cutting through Richards's defenses. And yet, despite these potential conflicts of interest, you made the decision to accuse my client of falsifying documents, a decision that could destroy her reputation, her work, and the community she's fought so hard to protect. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Emily felt the shift. Something had changed in the air. Richards's carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel. The cracks were widening, and he had nowhere to hide. James paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Your analysis was biased, Mr. Richards. It was not about finding the truth. It was about protecting a project that threatened the community you claim to serve. Richards looked visibly shaken now. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words failed him. The damage had been done. The courtroom was thick with tension as the final moments of the trial approached. Emily had never felt the weight of a case so heavily before. The truth was out in the open now. James had skillfully dismantled the prosecution's narrative, and the lies that had been spun around her had begun to unravel. But there was one final hurdle to overcome. The judge, his face unreadable, had announced a brief recess, a final chance for both sides to prepare their closing arguments. Emily sat at the defendant's table, her fingers clasped tightly together, trying to calm her racing heart. She could see James pacing at the front of the room, his mind already at work, strategizing his final words. He had always been calm under pressure, but she knew this was different. This wasn't just a case, it was her life, her future, and the future of the community she had spent so long fighting for. As the brief recess ended, the room filled with the sound of the judge's gavel, signaling the return to the courtroom. The prosecution, though clearly rattled by the holes James had exposed in their case, was ready to make one final push. Richard Vaughn stood with a smirk, his confidence still intact despite the chaos that had unfolded over the past few days. Your Honor, members of the jury, Vaughn began, his voice steady and rehearsed, this case has been about more than just the actions of one individual. It's about the future of our city, the future of the children who rely on this development for opportunities that will transform their lives. Emily could feel the heat rising in her chest. His words were hollow, designed to appeal to the jury's emotions, to make them believe that their decision would shape the future of so many. But Emily knew the truth. This wasn't about progress, it was about profit. It was about silencing people like her to make way for corporate interests, and she couldn't let that happen. James stood up, his presence filling the room as he walked confidently toward the front. He wasn't here to pander to emotion. He was here to deliver justice. His eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of the jury and the judge, before settling on Vaughn, who still stood at the prosecution table with his arms crossed, awaiting the final rebuttal. Your Honor, members of the jury, James began, his voice firm but calm. We've heard a lot about the future of this city, about the economic development that's supposedly at stake. But let me remind you, this trial is not about development. It's about truth. It's about a woman who has fought for her community, for the children who rely on the services that have been provided to them for years. The same community that is now under threat from those who would seek to destroy it for profit. He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air. He could see the jury members shifting slightly, some nodding, others leaning forward as they absorbed the weight of his argument. He wasn't just defending Emily anymore. He was defending every person who had ever been pushed aside in the name of progress. Vaughn and his team have presented a case built on lies, inconsistencies, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what true development means. What they fail to understand is that true progress is not measured in dollars or square footage. It's measured in the lives we touch, the communities we build, and the trust we foster with those who need us most. James's voice grew slightly softer but more resolute. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimonies. The truth is clear. Emily Jameson did not falsify documents. She did not obstruct justice. She fought to protect what truly matters, the future of her community, and she deserves justice for that. The room was still. The jury, once unsure, now seemed to shift in their seats with a sense of understanding. Emily could feel the air change. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about integrity, about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt that the tide had truly turned in her favor. The truth had a way of rising to the surface, and it was finally shining through. The final day of the trial had arrived, and the weight of everything that had led to this moment hung heavily in the air. The courtroom was silent as the jury deliberated, each member likely reflecting on the evidence they had seen, the words they had heard. Emily sat quietly at the defendant's table, her hands clasped in her lap, her thoughts drifting back over the months of struggle that had brought her to this point. She had fought with every ounce of her being to protect the community she loved. Now it was in the hands of 12 strangers. James stood beside her, his presence as unwavering as it had been throughout the trial. He had given everything to this case, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who deeply believed in the fight for justice. His steady gaze, his quiet confidence, had helped her hold on even in the darkest moments. She glanced at him now, and their eyes met for a brief second. Without words, they understood each other. No matter what happened next, they had fought the right fight. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the jury filed back in, their faces somber and focused. The judge took his seat, the gavel falling with a sharp thud. "The jury has reached a verdict," the judge said, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of the moment. He turned to the foreperson. "Will the jury please deliver its decision?" The foreperson stood, their eyes briefly meeting Emily's. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Emily Jameson, not guilty on all charges." Relief washed over Emily like a wave, and she could feel the weight of the past months fall off her shoulders in that single moment. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding, her chest tightening with emotion. There were no words for the gratitude and disbelief that surged through her. It was over. The fight was won. But more than that, the truth had triumphed. James reached out and gently squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had won together. Emily's eyes filled with tears, tears of relief, tears of victory, and tears for everything they had lost along the way. But there was no time to dwell on the past. The future lay ahead, and it was brighter than she had ever imagined. The courtroom erupted into a quiet buzz as the judge called for order, but Emily's mind felt like it was moving in slow motion. The words "not guilty on all charges" still echoed in her ears, a surreal but beautiful reality she could hardly grasp. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe fully, to let the years of anxiety and uncertainty slip away, piece by piece. James stood by her side, his expression softening into a rare smile. He wasn't one for grand gestures or public displays, but in that moment, his pride in her was palpable. They had both fought for this. He, with his knowledge of the law and his unshakable belief in justice, and she, with her fierce love for her community and her unwavering conviction that what she was doing was right. They had done it together. As the judge dismissed the courtroom, Emily and James stood, their hands still connected. They were free, finally free. The case was closed, but the battle for her community wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still a future to rebuild. The community center, once on the verge of demolition, now stood as a symbol of resistance and resilience. And Emily knew that her fight was just beginning in a different way. Walking out of the courtroom, they were met with the flashing lights of the press, eager to hear their story, but Emily felt no need to speak for the cameras. She had nothing to prove anymore. The truth had been heard. As they walked out into the sunshine, the weight of the past few months began to lift. The city stretched out before them, a vast landscape of possibility. James turned to Emily with a smile. Ready to go home? Emily nodded, her eyes bright with a new sense of hope. Ready. The fight had been long, and it had cost them both in ways they had never expected, but it had been worth it. Now they could begin to rebuild, together. The story that had started in the courtroom was far from over. It was just the beginning.